The young billionaire had always been a bit of an enigma, especially for someone his age. At just 16, he had already achieved more than most adults would in a lifetime. His wealth wasn't something he flaunted, nor was it something that defined him entirely. He preferred to keep a low profile, to move through the world quietly, focusing on the things that mattered to him the most: tech, innovation, and the future. This particular morning, he was headed to an international tech summit. It was his first solo trip, and though he had traveled many times before with his parents or assistants, this time felt different. He was on his own, and that brought a sense of freedom and excitement that was hard to put into words. As he arrived at the airport, he blended in with the crowd, his simple clothes and understated demeanor making him just another traveler in line. When it came time to board, he didn't rush. He wasn't concerned with getting the best seat or cutting in line. He had his boarding pass, his headphones, and a few books, his usual travel companions. The flight was long, and he wanted to make the most of the time by reading and relaxing. He wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere other than where he was. The plane was already bustling with passengers, most of them busy with their own thoughts, a few distracted by the usual pre-flight chatter. He approached his seat near the window, sliding past the rows of people. As he neared his spot, something caught his attention. An older man who appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s was sitting in his assigned seat. The boy paused for a moment, trying to process what was happening. At first, he thought maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe his seat was further down the row. But no, his boarding pass confirmed what he already knew. This was his seat. The man didn't seem to notice him standing there, and for a moment, the young billionaire hesitated. He wasn't one to make a scene, and part of him wanted to just walk past and let someone else handle it. But this was his seat, and he knew it. He cleared his throat gently, waiting for the man to notice. The man glanced up, his face showing slight confusion before quickly shifting to dismissive recognition. The boy spoke calmly, explaining that this was his seat. "Sorry, but I think this is mine," he said, showing the boarding pass to the man. The passenger raised an eyebrow, glancing at the ticket briefly before shaking his head. "No, I think you're mistaken," he replied, not even bothering to move. His tone was casual, almost dismissive, as though the boy was the one who had made an error. The boy's calm demeanor didn't change. He didn't raise his voice, didn't get frustrated. He simply repeated himself, "I'm sure this is my seat." The man, however, didn't budge. Instead, he shifted in his seat, stretching his legs out, clearly making no effort to stand up. The flight attendants, noticing the tension, came over to see what the issue was. They asked the man to vacate the seat, but the man refused. "I'm fine here," he said with a smirk. The attendants tried to be polite, explaining that this was the boy's seat, but the man, now clearly feeling uncomfortable, doubled down. "I'm not moving. There's plenty of other seats, right?" His voice was starting to rise, though he still didn't seem to take the situation seriously. The boy stayed silent, watching the exchange unfold. He knew he was in the right, but he also knew that arguing with this man would only escalate things. He didn't want to create a scene, especially not on a crowded flight. The attendant, looking slightly flustered, turned to him for guidance. The boy calmly nodded and said, "It's okay, we can sort this out." As the conversation continued, it became clear that the man was not going to change his mind. The young billionaire, always one to stay composed under pressure, could sense that this was not going to be a quick fix. He began to look around, noticing how passengers were starting to pay attention. Some of them were whispering, others were watching the interaction with mild curiosity. But for the boy, it wasn't about showing off or causing a scene. It wasn't even about the seat itself. He didn't care about winning some petty argument. What bothered him was the attitude, the sheer entitlement the man had in assuming he could simply claim a seat that wasn't his and expect no consequences. That sense of privilege that came with not having to follow the rules, not having to consider anyone else. The young boy's thoughts were interrupted by another passenger, an older woman who was sitting in the row ahead. She leaned over and said, "You should just sit somewhere else, dear. People like that are always a hassle." The woman didn't speak loudly, but her words were enough to stir a few chuckles among the passengers nearby. The boy appreciated the support, but he wasn't about to let the situation go. The flight attendants, now caught in the middle, asked the man to follow them to resolve the situation, but he shook his head. "No, I'm fine right here," he said. There was an edge to his voice now, a hint of defiance. The attendants, unsure of what to do next, glanced at each other. They weren't sure if they had the authority to force the man to move. The young boy could see they were hesitant, but he also knew they were trying their best to handle the situation professionally. As the minutes passed, the tension grew, not just between the boy and the man, but within the entire cabin. Everyone was watching, some hoping it would be resolved quickly, others waiting for something dramatic to unfold. The boy felt the weight of the moment, realizing that what had started as a simple misunderstanding was turning into something much bigger. The flight was delayed as the situation stretched on, and the crew began to consult with airline management. The boy's calm presence was starting to draw more attention now. No one knew who he was exactly, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made others pay attention. He didn't react to the man's comments, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he waited. And sometimes that was the most powerful thing you could do. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't about the flight. It was about standing your ground when you knew you were right, when you knew that a certain level of respect should be expected. The young boy had learned that lesson early in life, not through the power of wealth or influence, but through patience and self-assurance. And as the situation dragged on, that lesson was about to come into play in a way no one could have anticipated. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin only grew. Passengers had long stopped pretending not to notice the escalating situation. The young billionaire remained seated, his expression calm and controlled, though internally, he could feel the situation becoming more than just a disagreement over a seat. It was now about something deeper: fairness, respect, and entitlement. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. His patience, something his parents had instilled in him over the years, was now his greatest ally. The man in his seat, meanwhile, was growing more agitated. What started as a casual dismissal had now turned into a stubborn refusal. His body language was defensive, as though he was trying to assert his dominance over the situation. The flight attendants, now flustered, tried to reason with him again, but it seemed as though their words were having no effect. They suggested he move to another seat, offered him a glass of water, even asked if he needed assistance with anything. But the man's posture remained firm. Around them, the cabin was filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the occasional cough or murmur from passengers. Some were beginning to feel the weight of the moment. Others whispered to each other, trying to figure out how the situation would unfold. It was rare to see something like this happen on a plane, especially with so many eyes on it. In the midst of the growing tension, the young boy remained remarkably still. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. In fact, he was almost detached, as though watching a scene unfold that didn't directly involve him. But it did. His calmness wasn't indifference. It was a calculated decision, a decision to stay composed and let things play out. He knew that the more he got caught up in the drama, the harder it would be to resolve the situation peacefully. And he wanted it resolved, not for the sake of proving a point, but because he understood something many didn't. When you stand your ground with dignity, you don't need to force others to see your perspective. Eventually, they'll come around on their own. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to do anything. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't make a show of it. He simply unlocked it, clicked on the contact of his assistant, and pressed call. He didn't need to explain much. The assistant knew exactly what was happening. They'd been in these types of situations before, and the assistant understood how to handle them. The call didn't last long, just a few seconds, but it was enough to set things in motion. The assistant was calm but swift, reaching out to their contacts within the airline's corporate structure. The boy knew that he wasn't just any passenger, he had leverage. His family had built an empire, one that stretched across industries, from tech to media, and that influence carried weight. It wasn't about being a billionaire, it was about what that wealth allowed him to do: bring attention to an issue and, if necessary, resolve it in a way that worked for him. While the young boy was on the phone, The atmosphere on the plane had shifted. The man in the seat had become more defensive, raising his voice slightly, now clearly irritated. He made a few offhand comments to the flight attendants, suggesting they were harassing him. One of the flight attendants, clearly overwhelmed, turned to the other and whispered something the boy couldn't quite hear. It didn't matter. He was focused on what was happening in the larger picture. When the call ended, the boy calmly slipped his phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat. He wasn't in a rush. He knew the airline would act, and he wasn't going to let himself get pulled into a shouting match or waste any more energy on the matter. He glanced out the window, the clouds drifting lazily by as if nothing was wrong. The calmness he exuded only seemed to make the situation feel more surreal to those around him. Here was a teenager, quietly watching the drama unfold, with the power to shift the entire dynamic. A few minutes later, a senior flight attendant, accompanied by a manager, walked toward the front of the cabin. Their arrival was almost unnoticed at first, but as they approached, the passengers seemed to sense that something was about to change. The attendant, whose name tag read Claire, stopped near the man in the seat and in a calm voice explained that the airline had been made aware of the issue and that they needed to move him. The man, still sitting with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face, shook his head again, his voice rising with a tone of disbelief. "I'm not moving. This is ridiculous. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Claire glanced at the young boy, then back at the man. Her demeanor had changed. What had started as polite attempts to resolve the situation had shifted into something more serious. "I understand, sir," she said. "However, we've been instructed to move you to another seat." The man looked as though he was about to argue again, but before he could speak, another airline executive appeared. The man was mid-50s, wearing a suit and glasses that made him look every bit the corporate type. His voice was smooth but firm. "Sir, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave the flight if you refuse to move. We cannot proceed under these circumstances." The man's face turned red, a mix of anger and confusion. "What, you're kicking me off because of this? Are you serious?" His voice had gone from annoyed to outraged. The passengers, who had been watching in silence, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The boy could feel all eyes on him, even though no one had a clue who he was. The executive, clearly trained to deal with situations like this, stood firm. "I'm afraid it's non-negotiable, sir." He turned to Claire. "Please escort him off the plane." The man stood up abruptly, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. As he walked toward the exit, a few passengers muttered under their breath, their words hushed but filled with a sense of satisfaction. The young billionaire didn't react. He simply watched the man leave, his back straight and his posture still relaxed. To him, it wasn't about gloating or feeling vindicated. It was simply about the principle of the matter. Respect and fairness had to be upheld. As the man disappeared down the aisle, a low murmur spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks, their earlier discomfort slowly turning into curiosity. The tension, which had been so palpable moments before, seemed to lift. There was a sense of collective relief in the air, though no one spoke about it aloud. The young billionaire sat back in his seat, feeling the adrenaline that always came with these types of moments. But he didn't let it show. He wasn't there to make a spectacle of himself. He wasn't there to prove a point. He was there for a reason that had nothing to do with the chaos of the moment. The flight attendants, now relaxed, resumed their duties. They began moving up and down the aisles, making announcements about the flight and ensuring everyone was settled. The boy had already returned to his book, the one he had been reading when this whole incident had started. His calmness was unshaken, and as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't needed to do much. He hadn't needed to shout, to argue, or to make a scene. All he had done was handle the situation with dignity, and that was enough. As the engines roared to life and the plane took off, the young billionaire gazed out the window again, lost in his thoughts. The world below seemed so small, so distant, and in that moment, he realized that what mattered most wasn't the seat on a plane or the small battles we fought every day. What mattered was knowing when to stand up for what was right and doing it in a way that others couldn't help but respect. The plane finally settled into its cruising altitude, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the engines humming softly in the background. The young billionaire stared out the window, his thoughts drifting far from the chaos that had just unfolded. Despite the interruption, the flight seemed almost peaceful now. He could feel the weight of the attention that had shifted, the eyes of his fellow passengers still lingering on him, but he was accustomed to it. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself in a situation where people noticed his presence, but this time it felt different. He wasn't someone who sought attention. In fact, it was the opposite. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight, to live quietly despite his family's fame and fortune. But sometimes the nature of the world demanded attention, whether you wanted it or not. His experience had taught him that the best way to deal with it wasn't by fighting against it, but by remaining grounded, focusing on what mattered, and staying true to who he was. As the flight continued, he pulled his attention back to the book in his lap, but his mind kept wandering, replaying the events of the last hour. He had acted with patience, with control, but the entire situation still puzzled him. Why had the man refused to move? Why had he been so determined to cause a scene? It wasn't about the seat. That much was clear. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond the superficial exchange of space. The man had wanted to prove something. Maybe his entitlement, maybe his belief that rules didn't apply to him. It didn't matter now. What mattered was how things had been handled. The young boy's phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He knew it was his assistant, reaching out to confirm that everything was resolved. He quickly pulled it out, glancing at the message that had come through. All good. We've spoken with the airline's legal team. No issues moving forward. You handled that well. The simple message brought a small smile to his face, though it was more out of relief than pride. He didn't need validation. The situation had unfolded the way it was meant to. As the flight progressed, the boy's mind drifted back to his journey, the one he was actually on. This summit was important, and it wasn't just for personal growth. It was for the future, for ideas and innovation that could change the world. He wasn't there to play a game of public relations or to show off. He was there because he had something to offer, something unique that he believed could shape the next wave of technology. But it wasn't going to be easy. The industry was full of sharp minds, big egos, and even bigger companies. But the boy wasn't intimidated. He knew that his ideas, if given the chance, could make a real difference. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension from earlier had dissipated, but the quiet murmurs of conversation were still present. Some passengers exchanged glances with each other, perhaps wondering why the incident had been handled the way it had. Others were simply curious, trying to figure out who the boy was. It wasn't every day that you saw someone so calm in the face of such an awkward situation, and there was something compelling about that. It wasn't just his calmness, but the fact that he had made a decision to take control without raising his voice or demanding attention. It was a rare thing, a kind of quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. In the rows around him, people had slowly returned to their own worlds. Some returned to their books, others put in their earphones, and a few just stared out the window, as if nothing had happened. But the boy knew that this moment, this strange incident, would follow them all long after the plane landed. It would be something they'd remember, whether they wanted to or not. And perhaps for some it would be a lesson in itself. How to stand your ground. How to remain composed even when the world is watching. How to act with respect and dignity no matter what. After a few hours of flying, the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling that they would be approaching their destination soon. The boy glanced at his watch and stretched his legs. It had been a long journey, but it wasn't over yet. He had work to do, and he couldn't afford to be distracted by what had happened. There was still much to be done before he could call the trip a success. As the plane began its descent, the boy looked around the cabin once more. This time he could sense the curiosity of the people who had been watching him. Some were still glancing his way, trying to figure out who he was, why the situation had played out the way it had. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something about his composure that made it clear he wasn't someone who wanted to be known for a simple confrontation. He wasn't interested in the drama. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. All he wanted was to move forward, to continue with his journey, to make an impact in a world that often felt more interested in creating noise than in creating change. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt signs blinked off, the boy stood up, gathering his things. He moved through the aisles. With the same quiet confidence he had exuded all along, the flight attendants who had been so stressed earlier now smiled at him warmly. They had done their best, and they knew that the situation had been resolved because the young billionaire had stayed calm and allowed them to do their jobs. The boy walked off the plane without any fanfare, his mind already focused on the next step in his journey. Outside the terminal, a car waited to take him to the summit. His assistant had arranged everything as usual. As he sat in the back seat looking out at the city, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The events of the flight would be forgotten by most, but for him, they served as a reminder of how easy it was for people to let ego and entitlement get in the way of doing what was right. It was a lesson he had learned young, and it was one he would carry with him always. Stay true to who you are, act with integrity, and never let the noise of the world distract you from your purpose. The ride to the summit was quick, and as he arrived at the venue, the young billionaire stepped out of the car, ready to face the next challenge. He was no longer thinking about the man on the plane, or about the disruption that had briefly turned the flight into a spectacle. What mattered now was the summit, the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make a difference. Inside the building, the energy was palpable. There were people from all walks of life, entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, all gathered with a shared goal: to shape the future. And as the young billionaire walked through the halls, surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the world, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He was here for a reason, and nothing, not a disagreement over a seat or a brief moment of attention, would stand in the way of that. He took a deep breath, his thoughts narrowing to the task at hand. The journey was just beginning. The event was bustling with activity as the young billionaire entered the summit hall. The atmosphere was filled with a mix of excitement, curiosity, and anticipation. People from all over the world had gathered here. Innovators, entrepreneurs, investors, and thought leaders. They were all hoping to exchange ideas, network, and learn. For many, this was the perfect stage to showcase the work they had spent years developing. But for him, it wasn't about the spotlight. It was about the work, the ideas, and the connections that could move the world forward. He walked through the doors with a quiet confidence, his posture straight but relaxed. He wasn't someone who sought attention, and yet he could feel the eyes of others following him as he made his way through the hall. There were whispers, and some people exchanged knowing looks. It wasn't surprising. He was used to people recognizing him, especially now that his family's name carried weight in the tech industry. But he didn't let it affect him. He was here for one reason only: to engage with like-minded people, share his vision, and learn from those who were at the forefront of innovation. As he walked past groups of attendees, he heard snippets of conversation. Some were talking about the latest trends in artificial intelligence, others about the future of renewable energy. He smiled to himself, knowing that the possibilities for progress were endless. It was this kind of environment that inspired him. The energy of people who wanted to make a difference, who believed that technology and creativity could solve the world's biggest problems. He made his way toward the main stage area, where the keynote speaker was about to take the floor. A large crowd had already gathered, and the young boy found a seat near the front, eager to hear the insights that would be shared. As the room filled with eager faces, there was a hum of conversation. But when the speaker stepped up to the microphone, a wave of silence swept over the crowd. The energy in the room shifted. It was clear that this was a moment that everyone had been waiting for. The keynote speaker began talking about the intersection of technology, sustainability, and human progress. The words flowed with ease, but there was a sense of urgency in his voice, a call to action that resonated deeply with the audience. The boy listened carefully, nodding along, his mind already racing with ideas. He had his own plans, his own vision of how technology could be used to address some of the world's most pressing challenges, but hearing the speaker talk about the possibilities felt like fuel for his fire. He was motivated more than ever to continue working toward his own goals. As the speech ended, the crowd erupted into applause, and the young billionaire stood, clapping along with the rest. It wasn't just out of courtesy. He genuinely appreciated the ideas that had been shared. He didn't always agree with everything, but that was part of the process of learning. You listened, you challenged, and you grew. As people began to file out of the room, he made his way toward the smaller breakout sessions where more intimate discussions were taking place. The breakout sessions were always his favorite part of the summit. These smaller gatherings allowed for deeper conversations, where people could speak freely and exchange ideas without the pressure of a stage or a crowd. It was here that he had made some of his most valuable connections over the years. People who were willing to collaborate, People who shared his passion for innovation and, most importantly, people who understood the importance of using technology for good. He walked into one of the rooms and found it buzzing with activity. A group of entrepreneurs were gathered around a table, talking excitedly about the future of smart cities and how technology could be integrated into urban design to improve efficiency, reduce waste, and enhance the quality of life for residents. He joined the conversation, listening intently as they discussed the challenges and opportunities in creating cities that were not only sustainable, but also connected in ways that promoted a sense of community. As he listened, he couldn't help but think back to the events of the flight earlier that day. The man who had refused to give up his seat had been a symbol of a different kind of thinking, one that was rooted in entitlement and disregard for others. It was easy to forget, in a world filled with competition and ambition, that respect for others was just as important as the drive for success. In these conversations, he saw the opposite, the shared belief that the best ideas came from collaboration, from listening to others, and from building something together that could truly make a difference. For the boy, this was the essence of leadership, the ability to bring people together, to inspire them, and to move forward with a collective vision. He had learned this lesson from a young age. Growing up in a world of privilege, it had been easy to fall into the trap of thinking that success was about individual achievement. But over the years, he had come to realize that the greatest accomplishments were always the result of collaboration, of working with others toward a common goal. And in this room with these passionate innovators, he could feel the spark of possibility that came from shared purpose. The discussions continued late into the afternoon, and as the room began to thin out, the boy found himself talking to a group of young tech developers who were working on a groundbreaking project involving renewable energy and AI. They had a prototype that could change the way energy was generated, stored, and distributed, making it more efficient and sustainable. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and the boy was immediately drawn to their vision. He saw the potential in what they were doing, and he knew that he could help them take their project to the next level. They exchanged contact information, and before long, they were making plans to meet again. The boy was excited by the possibilities of working with this group. It wasn't just about creating something new. It was about creating something that would leave a lasting impact, something that would help address the climate crisis and shape a better future. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the kind of challenge he thrived on. And it was the kind of challenge that brought people together, just like the conversations he had witnessed throughout the day. As the evening began to fall, the boy stepped outside the conference hall, taking a deep breath of fresh air. The city around him was alive with activity, lights twinkling in the distance. It was a reminder of how much work there was still to be done. But it was also a reminder of the potential that lay ahead. He had made connections today, had learned new things, and had deepened his understanding of the world. He felt more confident than ever in his ability to contribute to the future. The summit was winding down, but the boy didn't feel tired. He was energized, driven by the conversations he had participated in, the ideas that had been shared, and the opportunities that lay ahead. He could feel the momentum building, the excitement of a new phase in his life and career. The road ahead would require dedication, patience, and a willingness to keep pushing forward, even when things got difficult, but that was a challenge he was ready for. As he made his way back to his hotel room, he thought about the flight that morning. The moment on the plane, with all its tension and conflict, now seemed distant, like a faint memory. In the grand scheme of things, it was just a small moment, a blip on the radar of a much bigger journey. What mattered now was the work ahead, the people he had met, and the possibilities that were unfolding. He sat down on the edge of his bed and looked out the window at the city below. There was so much to do, so much to learn, and so much to contribute. And with that thought, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to be part of something larger than himself. The world was full of challenges, but it was also full of potential. And with that potential, there was always room for change, for growth, and for making a difference. The next few days flew by in a blur of meetings, discussions, and presentations. The young billionaire had settled into the rhythm of the summit, absorbing every conversation and idea that came his way. The connections he had made, both personal and professional, were already beginning to take shape. He could feel the potential of each new partnership, each conversation, as it began to weave into the larger tapestry of his ambitions. But despite the excitement of the summit, the events of the flight still lingered in the back of his mind. He had thought it was over, that it had been just a moment in time, but something about it kept pulling at him. It wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the way people reacted to it, the way they had watched, the way they had taken sides. It had been a small moment, but it had sparked something in him, a deeper reflection on how people responded to conflict, how they handled entitlement and privilege, and how they saw themselves in relation to others. He had learned a lot in the past few days, but it was in the quiet moments away from the buzz of the summit that he found himself thinking the most. He was sitting by the window in his hotel room one evening, looking out at the skyline when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant. "We've been contacted by the airline. They want to talk. They're worried about the incident." He sighed, his thoughts returning to the flight. He knew it wasn't over. When you're as influential as he was, things don't just disappear. People talk. The airline, of course, wanted to be sure everything had been handled properly, that no bad press would come from the situation. The boy understood that, but he wasn't interested in playing the game of damage control. He hadn't acted with that in mind. He had simply done what felt right. He tapped out a quick response. "Set up a meeting. Let's hear them out." A few hours later, he found himself sitting in a conference room in the heart of the city, facing a group of airline executives. They were all well-dressed, well-spoken, and polished, everything you'd expect from people in positions of power. But as they sat across from him, he couldn't help but notice the underlying nervousness in their demeanor. They were there to make sure nothing went wrong, to ensure their reputation stayed intact. The young billionaire listened as they explained their concerns, speaking in careful, measured tones. They apologized for the incident on the flight, acknowledging that the situation could have been handled differently. They reassured him that they had already taken steps to prevent something like this from happening again. But there was something in their eyes that told him they were hoping for something more, something from him. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully about what to say. He didn't want to hurt them. He didn't want to make them feel small or insignificant. But at the same time, he knew that they needed to hear the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. He wasn't here to be a figurehead or to play politics. He was here because he believed in fairness and respect. "I appreciate your apology," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But the real issue here isn't the seat or the flight. It's the way the situation unfolded. It's how the man felt entitled to ignore the rules and take something that wasn't his. And it's how the crew handled it, or more accurately, how they didn't handle it. It's about respect. Not just for the passengers, but for the system that keeps everything running smoothly." He paused, looking at each of them. "What I did wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about setting an example. I've been given a lot in life, but I also know that with privilege comes responsibility. It's easy to assume that you can get away with things, that the world owes you something. But that's not how it works. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, nothing will ever change." There was a long silence in the room as the executives absorbed his words. He could see the wheels turning in their heads, and for a brief moment he wondered if they truly understood. He wasn't looking for them to apologize again, nor was he looking for praise. He just wanted them to see things differently, to understand that it wasn't about the situation, it was about the bigger picture. Finally, one of the executives spoke up. "You're right," she said quietly. "We've learned a lot from this. We'll do better next time." The others nodded in agreement, their faces softening. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The boy didn't expect miracles, but he knew that by standing his ground and speaking his truth, he had made an impact. It was never about making people feel bad or guilty. It was about raising awareness, making them reflect, and hopefully changing their behavior in the future. The meeting ended shortly after that. The executives seemed relieved, and the boy left the room feeling like he had done what he needed to do. He didn't want to be involved in their public relations battle, but he did want them to understand that the way they handled situations like that mattered. It wasn't just about fixing things on the surface. It was about addressing the root causes and changing the way people thought. As he made his way back to his hotel, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, not because he had won the confrontation on the plane, but because he had used his position to influence change in a way that felt right. It was moments like these that defined leadership, knowing when to speak up, when to be quiet, and when to stand firm for what you believed in. That night, As he sat in his hotel room reflecting on the day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The summit was drawing to a close, and soon he would be heading back home. But this experience, the flight, the meeting with the airline, the people he had met, it had all given him a clearer vision of what he wanted to do next. He wasn't just building a legacy for himself. He was building something bigger, something that could make the world a better place. The technology he was working on, the ideas he was developing, the partnerships he was forging, it was all part of a greater mission. But that mission wasn't just about success. It was about responsibility, about using his position to help others, to make sure that the future he was working toward was one where fairness and respect were the norm, not the exception. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and moments when it would seem like progress was impossible. But the boy knew that he was ready. He had learned from his experiences, and he had learned from the people he met. He understood now more than ever that leadership wasn't about being in control. It was about inspiring others to believe in a better future and helping them get there. As he packed his things and prepared to leave the city, he felt a quiet sense of excitement for what was to come. The work ahead would be challenging, but it would also be rewarding. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The flight home was uneventful, and this time, there were no seat disputes, no tensions. He was alone with his thoughts, looking out the window as the plane soared through the sky. The world below seemed so small, so distant, but the possibilities felt endless. The young billionaire had learned a valuable lesson, that sometimes it's the quiet moments, the ones where you stand your ground and act with integrity, that shape the course of your future. And as the plane descended toward home, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that the journey had only just begun.